Today I want to share with you a testimony that was entrusted to me by someone who experienced something that completely transformed their understanding of what it means to be alive, what it means to die, and what lies beyond this physical existence. This remarkable person has graciously given me permission to share their story with you under one specific condition, that I carefully change all the names and locations to protect their privacy and the privacy of everyone involved in their story. I want to be absolutely transparent with you. While I have changed these identifying details, every spiritual element of what this person experienced remains exactly, precisely as it occurred. Every encounter with divine beings, every message they received, every profound revelation, all of it has been preserved with complete faithfulness to their actual experience. Not one spiritual detail has been altered or embellished. The purpose of sharing this powerful testimony is to bring you into a deeper awareness of the spiritual dimension that surrounds us constantly, to strengthen your relationship with God, and to help you understand that what we call death is simply a transition, a doorway into something far more glorious and beautiful than our human minds can fully comprehend. My prayer is that this story will speak to your heart, strengthen your faith, and bring you peace about the eternal nature of our souls. May it remind you that we are spiritual beings having a temporary human experience, and that love is the only thing that truly lasts forever. James Rivera had devoted 28 years of his life to protecting and serving the people of Central Arizona as a firefighter and emergency medical technician. In 1994, he was stationed at Rescue Station 9, which served the greater Phoenix metropolitan area, and he approached every aspect of his work with unwavering dedication and commitment. James wasn't someone who simply went through the motions or counted down the hours until his shift ended. He genuinely, deeply cared about every single person he encountered during emergency responses, treating each individual with respect, dignity, and compassion as if they were his own beloved family member. He would often stop by people's homes days after an emergency call just to check on their recovery and see if they needed anything. He remembered people's names, their children's names, their stories. His colleagues at the station respected and admired him tremendously for his integrity and his compassionate heart. Beyond his professional identity as a first responder, James was deeply passionate about physical fitness and competitive athletics. He had completed more than 30 marathons across the southwestern United States and had successfully finished 3 complete Ironman triathlon competitions. His physical conditioning was absolutely exceptional, his cardiovascular system functioning with remarkable efficiency. But all of his physical strength, all of his extensive medical training, all of his years of experience responding to countless emergencies couldn't possibly prepare him for what was about to happen during that difficult winter season. A severe influenza epidemic had swept across Arizona and neighboring states that year, hitting the Phoenix metropolitan area with devastating force. Hospitals and medical facilities throughout the entire region were operating far beyond their designed capacity. Emergency departments were packed wall to wall with desperately ill patients, many experiencing life-threatening complications from the aggressive flu strain. Medical personnel were working exhausting shifts around the clock, sometimes going 30 or 40 hours without adequate rest, doing everything humanly possible to manage the overwhelming surge of critically ill patients. James and his crew at Station 9 were responding to medical emergency calls continuously, barely having time to restock their ambulance between runs. Every single shift felt like an impossible endurance test. Every emergency transport brought them face to face with another person fighting desperately for their life, another terrified family watching helplessly as their loved ones struggled to breathe. The entire regional emergency medical system was strained beyond its limits, and the crisis showed no signs of ending anytime soon. One particular emergency call during that devastating flu epidemic would fundamentally alter the entire trajectory of James's life in ways he could never have anticipated or imagined. He and his partner were dispatched to a small residential home in a quiet neighborhood on the western edge of Phoenix. When they arrived at the single-story adobe-style house and were let inside by a deeply worried neighbor who had called for help, they discovered a woman who had isolated herself in her bedroom for several days. She had completely sealed herself away in that dark room when the illness first struck her. Every window was covered with thick blankets and towels to block out all light. The door had been shut tight. The air inside the room was oppressively hot, thick and stagnant. The woman was in critical, life-threatening condition, her breathing extremely shallow and labored, her fever so dangerously elevated that her skin felt like it was radiating intense heat. She had been far too weak to leave her bed for nearly 5 full days, barely maintaining consciousness, surviving on nothing but sheer willpower and stubbornness, until the neighbor heard her weak moaning through the shared wall and immediately called emergency services. James instantly shifted into complete emergency response mode. He climbed carefully onto the bed and positioned himself strategically so he could properly secure an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. His movements were practiced, efficient and confident, adjusting the elastic straps carefully, checking meticulously to ensure the mask created a proper seal for optimal oxygen delivery. But at the precise instant, he leaned forward closely to verify the mask placement was correct. The woman suddenly coughed violently and exhaled forcefully directly into his unprotected face. James inhaled at exactly that same moment. He felt the warm, contaminated breath rush straight down his throat directly into his lungs. As a highly trained and experienced EMT, he recognized immediately what had just happened. He had received direct, unprotected exposure to whatever virulent pathogen this critically ill woman was carrying. But he firmly pushed the worrying thought aside and remained completely focused on his patient. He got her condition stabilized as much as possible, helped his partner carefully load her onto their stretcher, and they transported her emergently with lights and sirens to the nearest hospital that still had capacity to accept critical patients. Less than 40 hours later, James began experiencing symptoms more severe and frightening than anything he had ever encountered in his entire life. The illness attacked his body with shocking speed and intensity. His body temperature spiked dangerously high, climbing to 105 degrees and beyond. Every single muscle and joint in his body ached with intense, grinding pain that made movement almost impossible. His head pounded with such severe pressure that even the dimmest light or quietest sound became absolutely unbearable torture. But what frightened him most deeply was the rapid, relentless dehydration that was literally draining his life away. His body was violently rejecting everything. He couldn't keep down water, food, medication. Nothing at all would stay in his system. His digestive system was in complete, total rebellion, purging fluids rapidly from every possible direction. He could literally feel his body shutting down systematically, his strength evaporating and disappearing hour by hour as his vital organs began failing from acute, severe dehydration. On the 3rd full day of this absolute nightmare, James attempted to get out of his bed. His legs immediately buckled and collapsed underneath him. He grabbed desperately onto the edge of the nightstand to prevent himself from falling completely to the floor, and somehow managed to stumble and half crawl across the room to the bathroom. When he finally looked at his reflection in the mirror above the sink, what he saw shocked him into a moment of absolute, terrifying clarity. The face staring back at him from the mirror looked like death personified. His face had become completely skeletal, the skin pulled so impossibly tight over his skull that every bone was sharply visible. His eyes had receded deep into dark, hollow, sunken sockets. His skin had taken on a grayish-yellow color that looked exactly like a corpse. He genuinely looked like a dead man still somehow standing upright. James's extensive medical training and experience automatically activated. He reached down with his trembling, shaking hands to check his radial pulse at his wrist, a fundamental vital sign assessment he had performed literally thousands upon thousands of times on patients throughout his long career in emergency medicine. He pressed his fingers firmly against the inside of his wrist, searching desperately for that familiar, reassuring, rhythmic beating. Nothing. He couldn't detect anything at all. He pressed harder, applied more pressure, moved his fingers carefully to slightly different positions, tried his other wrist with equal determination and focus. Still absolutely nothing. He couldn't locate a pulse anywhere on his body. His medical knowledge and training immediately told him exactly what this critical sign meant. His blood pressure had dropped catastrophically low, almost certainly below 60 millimeters of mercury, possibly even lower than that. His heart was racing frantically, beating at what felt like 170 beats per minute. But his blood pressure was so dangerously, critically, life-threateningly low, that the peripheral pulse in his wrists had completely disappeared. James somehow summoned enough remaining strength to get himself back to the bedroom. He called out weakly, desperately to his family. His brother-in-law, an experienced registered nurse who had been staying with them that week to help care for James's elderly mother, heard his voice and came running immediately into the room. He took one look at James's critical condition, and his face went completely pale with recognition, fear, and alarm. He grabbed the telephone without any hesitation and dialed 911. Within 7 minutes, a Phoenix Fire Department rescue unit arrived at the residence. Colleagues and close personal friends who had worked side by side with James for many years. When they saw the absolutely critical condition he was in, several of them had visible tears forming in their eyes. They immediately, without delay, established 2 large-bore intravenous lines in his arms and began running normal saline solution wide open at maximum flow rate, trying desperately to replace at least some of his catastrophic, life-threatening fluid loss. They loaded him as carefully and gently as possible onto their ambulance and transported him Code 3, full lights and sirens blaring, absolute maximum priority, to the Regional Trauma Center in downtown Phoenix, approximately 35 minutes away through heavy traffic, which had the advanced medical resources and specialized intensive care staffing necessary to handle the most critical cases during the ongoing epidemic crisis. When James arrived at the trauma center's massive emergency department, the scene was one of barely controlled chaos and overwhelming activity. The enormous waiting room was completely packed full of patients, many of them obviously gravely, critically ill. Every single treatment room and examination bay was occupied with patients. Long rows of gurneys lined both sides of the hallways, with patients waiting desperately, sometimes for hours, to be evaluated and treated. Medical personnel were literally running from room to room to room, their faces showing the profound exhaustion, stress, and strain from working impossibly long hours, day after day after day, trying desperately to manage the completely overwhelming patient volume that just kept coming. James was wheeled rapidly into a treatment bay, where an emergency medicine physician, who looked like he hadn't slept properly in at least 3 or 4 days, was working frantically, almost desperately, to manage what seemed like an utterly impossible, hopeless situation. The exhausted physician had essentially implemented a standardized treatment algorithm and protocol for all influenza patients coming through his overwhelmed emergency department. The clinical approach was straightforward, practical, and evidence-based, given the desperate circumstances. Administer appropriate analgesic pain medication, typically a morphine-based compound, combined with effective antiemetic medication to help patients tolerate oral rehydration solutions. The doctor was moving with urgent speed from patient to patient to patient to patient, barely taking adequate time to review individual medical charts anymore. He was simply trying to keep as many people alive as humanly possible and provide at least some measure of relief from their terrible, intense suffering while the epidemic continued its devastating course through the entire community. James remained in that crowded, noisy treatment bay for approximately 1 hour. The intravenous fluids gradually, slowly began to take some effect and provide some relief. 4 complete bags of normal saline solution flowed steadily into his severely, dangerously dehydrated system, and he started to feel just marginally, slightly more human, coherent, and alert. His heart rate began to decrease somewhat from its frantic racing pace. The severe confusion and disorientation clouding his mind started to clear just a little bit, just enough for him to think somewhat more clearly. He managed with considerable effort and determination to sit himself upright on the gurney and told his wife, who had followed the ambulance separately to the hospital in their family car, that he thought he might possibly be stable enough now to continue his recovery at home in his own comfortable bed. They could manage aggressive oral rehydration there with electrolyte solutions, he reasoned hopefully, and he would certainly feel better and recover more quickly in his own familiar, comfortable surroundings. But the nurse who came to check his vital signs explained patiently, but very firmly, that hospital protocol during the epidemic emergency was absolutely clear, specific, and non-negotiable. Every single patient presenting with this particular constellation of symptoms received the standardized medication regimen before discharge, and absolutely no exceptions were being made for anyone. regardless of their profession or connections. The emergency department was strictly following evidence-based clinical guidelines to ensure consistency and quality of care across all patients. James, who had always deeply respected medical authority and understood thoroughly the critical importance of following established clinical protocols and guidelines, simply nodded his acceptance and agreement without argument. He trusted the medical system completely and without reservation. He had been an integral, dedicated, committed part of that very system for nearly 3 decades. What happened in the next few critical minutes would become permanently, indelibly seared into his wife's memory and consciousness, haunting her dreams and nightmares for many years to come. The nurse carefully, methodically prepared 2 syringes at the medication preparation station, one containing Nubain, which is a potent synthetic morphine derivative compound with powerful analgesic properties, and another containing a strong antiemetic medication specifically designed to control severe nausea and vomiting. James was sitting upright on the very edge of the gurney, actually beginning to swing his legs over the side to stand up and get dressed for discharge home, when the nurse approached professionally and administered both medications directly and rapidly into his intravenous port access. She pushed them in quickly, competently, emptying both syringes completely in rapid succession, perhaps 10 to 15 seconds total administration time. Within just moments, perhaps only 5 to 8 seconds at the very most, James's eyes suddenly rolled dramatically upward and backward in his head until only the whites were visible to anyone watching. His wife later described it as one of the single most terrifying, disturbing, horrifying things she had ever witnessed in her entire life. It looked completely unnatural, wrong, and nightmarish, like something from a horror film. Then his entire body went completely, totally rigid, every single muscle simultaneously locked in severe, intense spasm. He toppled straight backward onto the gurney like a felled tree, hitting it hard with significant impact, completely unconscious before his head even made contact with the thin, inadequate institutional pillow. Immediately, instantly, within seconds, the treatment bay absolutely exploded with urgent emergency activity. A full code blue was called loudly, urgently overhead through the entire hospital's public address announcement system. Medical personnel came running rapidly and converging from every conceivable direction throughout the emergency department. Doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, pharmacists, medical students all swarmed densely around James's gurney in organized but intense chaos. They immediately recognized exactly what was happening. James was experiencing a severe, life-threatening adverse reaction to the administered medications, essentially an iatrogenic overdose, causing profound respiratory depression and catastrophic, potentially fatal cardiovascular collapse. Someone quickly grabbed Narcan from the nearby mobile crash cart and administered it rapidly, urgently intravenously through his IV line. Narcan is the specific emergency reversal agent for opiate and opioid overdoses. It functions by immediately blocking opiate receptors throughout the entire body and brain and rapidly reversing their dangerous, potentially lethal effects. They gave James one complete full dose intravenously, then quickly, urgently followed with a second full dose within just 60 seconds. Additional intravenous access was rapidly established with even larger bore catheters to maximize fluid delivery. The gurney was immediately tilted into steep Trendelenburg position, head down, feet significantly elevated, in an attempt to maximize available blood flow and perfusion to his brain and other absolutely vital organs. But despite all of these aggressive, appropriate, textbook-perfect interventions performed rapidly by highly skilled, experienced medical professionals, James's condition continued to deteriorate rapidly, alarmingly, frighteningly. His blood pressure had plummeted catastrophically to 36/0. Essentially, technically, his heart was still mechanically beating and contracting, but it wasn't generating anywhere near sufficient pressure to adequately perfuse his organs and tissues with desperately needed oxygenated blood throughout his body. The experienced trauma team made an immediate, urgent decision to transfer him directly to the intensive care unit on the 5th floor. They worked on him intensively, continuously throughout the entire long, dark night, constantly, continuously adjusting medications and dosages, monitoring his vital signs minute by minute, doing absolutely everything medically possible, appropriate, and indicated to keep him alive. When morning finally arrived and the ICU attending physician made his early morning rounds, he sat down with James's wife in a small private consultation room to explain carefully, thoroughly, and in considerable detail what had happened from a physiological, biochemical, and medical standpoint. The morphine-based medication James received caused something called systemic vasodilation throughout his entire circulatory system and vascular tree, the doctor explained carefully, patiently, and thoroughly. He tried earnestly to explain it in clear terms that she could understand and comprehend without extensive medical background. Imagine your blood vessels, your arteries, veins, and tiny capillaries as an incredibly complex, intricate network of tubes and pipes filled with fluid, he said slowly and clearly. Under normal, healthy physiological conditions, those tubes maintain a certain specific diameter and caliber, and there's sufficient blood volume circulating inside them to completely fill that vascular space and create the pressure that's absolutely necessary and critical for proper circulation throughout your entire body and all your organs. But the medication James received caused all of his blood vessels to dilate dramatically, suddenly, and significantly. The walls of the tubes expanded rapidly and substantially. Suddenly, instantaneously, the volume of blood in his body, which had already been significantly, severely depleted by 3 full days of severe, uncontrolled dehydration, was nowhere near sufficient or adequate to fill this dramatically, suddenly expanded vascular space. His blood pressure collapsed absolutely, catastrophically, and his entire body began shutting down systemically, organ by organ. The doctor explained honestly, directly, and candidly that the only reason James was probably, likely still alive at all was his truly exceptional, remarkable cardiovascular conditioning from literally decades of competitive endurance athletics and consistent, dedicated training. His heart and entire circulatory system were so remarkably efficient, so exceptionally well-trained and conditioned at delivering oxygen even under extreme physiological stress and adverse conditions, that even with dangerously, critically, life-threateningly low blood pressure, his vital organs had somehow, miraculously managed to receive just barely enough oxygen to avoid complete and irreversible catastrophic failure and death. James never regained consciousness in any conventional medical sense during that long, dark, difficult night in the intensive care unit. His physical body lay completely motionless, still and unresponsive on that hospital bed, surrounded by constantly beeping monitors, humming ventilators, and quietly operating life support machines. But sometime between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning, when his physical form was hovering precariously on the very edge, the absolute razor's edge between life and death, something absolutely extraordinary, miraculous, and profound happened. James left his body completely. The experience began with a sensation that he would spend literally the rest of his entire life trying desperately to find adequate words to properly, accurately describe. It felt as if he had been imprisoned, trapped, confined inside a cramped, hot, suffocating cell or box for as long as he could possibly remember or imagine, and suddenly, instantly, miraculously, without warning, the walls simply dissolved and vanished completely into nothingness. He was released, freed into boundless, limitless, infinite space. The relief was so overwhelming, so complete and absolute and total, that it brought him immediately to a state of ecstatic, rapturous, overwhelming joy, far beyond anything he had ever experienced, felt, or imagined possible during his entire physical life on Earth. He found himself floating peacefully, serenely in a vast, infinite, limitless expanse filled with massive, enormous, luminous spheres of different brilliant, beautiful, vibrant colors. These weren't stars as we see them twinkling distantly in the night sky. They were conscious beings, living entities composed entirely of pure light and divine, sacred energy, and they radiated such powerful, unconditional, limitless love and complete acceptance that James felt like he was being embraced tenderly by the very heart and essence of the universe itself, by God himself. He understood immediately, instinctively, intuitively that these were what various spiritual and religious traditions throughout history call light beings or angelic presences or divine messengers or celestial beings. But reading about them in books or hearing second-hand descriptions was absolutely nothing. Nothing at all compared to experiencing them directly, immediately, personally. This was real. This was actually happening. This was infinitely more beautiful, magnificent and glorious than anything he could have possibly conceived of, dreamed of, or imagined in his wildest dreams or fantasies. James himself no longer existed in any kind of physical form whatsoever. He had become an expansive, vast, infinite field of pure consciousness without any boundaries, limitations, restrictions, or constraints whatsoever. The sensation was indescribably, impossibly, incredibly pleasurable, blissful far beyond any possible comparison to physical pleasure, earthly joy, or human happiness. It was as if every atom of his being, every particle of his consciousness, every fiber of his existence was vibrating and resonating harmoniously, with pure, absolute, perfect joy and ecstasy and bliss. If he had to try to describe it using physical analogies and comparisons from earthly experience, he said it felt exactly like warm, golden, liquid light was being poured gently, continuously, directly into the very core, the very center of his consciousness, and then radiating outward powerfully, brilliantly through every single aspect of his existence, his being, bringing absolutely everything alive with rapture and ecstasy and perfect bliss. The pleasure was so intense, so all-encompassing, so overwhelming and complete, that it made every good feeling, every moment of happiness, every experience of joy he had ever experienced during his entire physical life seem like a faint, pale, insignificant shadow by comparison. It was like comparing a single tiny candle flame, flickering in darkness, to the brilliant, blazing, overwhelming light of the sun at high noon on a clear summer day. As he moved through this infinite space, he described it as flying or floating or simply being, though there was no air or physical space in any conventional material, three-dimensional sense, surrounded constantly by these welcoming, loving, joyful beings of pure light and divine energy. A profound realization struck him with such tremendous, overwhelming force that it shook him to his absolute core, to the very foundation of his being. How had he forgotten? How was it even remotely possible, conceivable, that he had been so completely, thoroughly, totally convinced that he was James Rivera, a firefighter and paramedic from Arizona, with a specific career and family relationships and daily responsibilities and concerns and worries and fears and anxieties, because existing there, floating there, being there, in that space of pure consciousness and infinite love, he knew with absolute, complete, unshakable, unquestionable certainty that all of that, the entire physical life, was ultimately, fundamentally an elaborate illusion, a temporary experience, a dream. His true identity, his authentic, real, eternal self, was this vast, eternal, limitless consciousness, this boundless being of pure light and unconditional love and infinite awareness. The human life, the physical existence, the personality and memories and experiences of James Rivera, all of it was like a costume or outfit he had put on for a theatrical play or performance, a role he had agreed to perform temporarily, and he had become so deeply, completely absorbed in the performance, so identified with the character that he had totally, completely forgotten he was an actor playing a part, wearing a costume. The physical world, with all of its drama and pain and struggle and suffering and fear and anxiety, was a temporary experience, a temporary classroom, an intricate, elaborate game that came with being born into a material, physical, mortal body. But this realm of infinite light and unconditional love and limitless consciousness and perfect peace, this was home. This was ultimate reality. This was who he truly was and had always been since the very beginning of time, since before time itself existed. After what felt simultaneously like both a single instant and an eternity, time simply didn't function, operate, or exist normally in that realm at all, James felt himself gently, gradually descending and landing somewhere specific, somewhere intentional. The sensation of floating through infinite space gradually, slowly stopped, and he became aware of standing firmly on something solid, real, and substantial beneath him. He looked around with wonder, amazement, and awe, and saw that he was inside some kind of facility, structure or building of some kind. It had walls that seemed to emit, radiate their own soft, gentle, warm, comforting illumination from no identifiable, visible, or discernible light source. There were tables positioned strategically, purposefully throughout the space, and various pieces of equipment or machinery or instruments that he couldn't quite identify, recognize, understand, or comprehend. The entire place felt purposeful, organized and intentional, but also somehow simultaneously playful, joyful and loving, like a workshop or laboratory where important but deeply enjoyable, meaningful work was being accomplished with joy. And then he noticed them standing there patiently, 3 short beings positioned directly in front of him, watching him with obvious delight, amusement, joy, and deep affection. These 3 beings were unlike anything James had ever seen, encountered, experienced, or imagined in his entire life on Earth. They stood approximately 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with compact, sturdy, solid, robust builds. They wore what appeared to be dark robes or cloaks with hoods attached, but the hoods were pushed back sufficiently, far enough that James could clearly, distinctly see their faces in considerable detail. They looked somewhat like the gnomes or dwarves or elves from ancient fairy tales, mythology and folklore, with round, friendly, kind, gentle faces and incredibly bright, sparkling, twinkling, luminous eyes. And they were smiling, huge, genuine, authentic, ear-to-ear smiles that radiated pure joy, playful mischief, and profound, deep, unconditional love. Their eyes twinkled and sparkled brilliantly with playfulness, humor, and ancient, timeless, infinite wisdom. They reminded James of excited, joyful, delighted children who had just been told the most wonderful, amazing news imaginable, except these beings were clearly, obviously ancient, timeless, eternal, and infinitely wise despite their playful, childlike demeanor, behavior, and energy. The 3 beings immediately, without delay, began asking James questions in rapid succession, speaking in overlapping musical voices that had a joyful, almost giggling, laughing quality to them. "How was your journey down there in the physical world?" one asked with obvious enthusiasm, excitement, and genuine interest. "Tell us absolutely everything you experienced," another exclaimed eagerly, enthusiastically, bouncing slightly with anticipation and excitement. "What did you discover? What did you learn? What was it like? How do you feel now?" The third one added enthusiastically, practically vibrating, humming with excitement and curiosity. They were exactly like dear, beloved, cherished friends, welcoming someone home after a long, extended journey or trip abroad, eager and excited to hear all about the adventure, the experiences, the lessons learned. James stood there feeling somewhat disoriented, confused, overwhelmed, and uncertain. He had a strange, odd, peculiar sense that he should recognize and know these beings, that they were somehow familiar to him on some profound, deep, fundamental level. But his memory felt foggy, clouded, unclear, and inaccessible. He tried earnestly to gather his scattered, disorganized thoughts so he could respond appropriately, adequately to their enthusiastic, eager, sincere questions. Then one of the 3 turned to his 2 companions, gestured toward James with an amused, playful, affectionate expression on his friendly face, and said something that made all 3 of them burst into absolutely delighted, infectious, joyful laughter. "Look at him. He doesn't remember us at all. Not even a little bit. He's completely forgotten." The being announced cheerfully, joyfully, and they all found this absolutely hilarious, amusing, and entertaining. They laughed and nudged each other affectionately, playfully, clearly finding tremendous humor, joy, and delight in the situation. James wanted to protest immediately, wanted to explain that he did feel some sense of recognition, familiarity, and connection, that there was something he couldn't quite place or identify about them, even if he couldn't remember specific details or memories. But before he could form and speak the words, his attention was suddenly powerfully drawn to another presence approaching from somewhere deeper within the structure, from further back in the facility. This new being was completely and utterly different from the 3 hooded figures in every possible way, in every conceivable aspect. He was extraordinarily, impossibly tall, perhaps 9 or 10 feet if you attempted to measure him using conventional measurements, and impossibly, incredibly slender, with a form that appeared to be composed entirely of luminous mist or vapor rather than any kind of solid, physical, material matter. He reminded James of a stretched, elongated version of those flexible clay animation characters, or perhaps like an impossibly tall, thin willow tree swaying gently in a breeze, except his entire body, his entire form seemed to be made of swirling, glowing, luminous fog or mist or vapor. When this extraordinary being moved and walked, it was absolutely mesmerizing, hypnotic, and beautiful to watch. Different parts of his form would drift apart gracefully and then flow smoothly, beautifully, harmoniously back together, like watching someone move gracefully underwater, where gentle currents catch their clothing and hair and create beautiful, fluid, graceful, dance-like patterns. Despite his unusual, extraordinary, and completely otherworldly appearance, he had a distinct, clear, recognizable face, and that face wore the most beautiful, warm, radiant, loving, compassionate smile James had ever witnessed or experienced in his entire existence. His eyes were absolutely extraordinary, remarkable, luminous, brilliant, and filled with such profound, overwhelming, infinite love and compassion that James could barely stand to look directly into them for more than a brief moment without feeling completely overwhelmed, without feeling like he might simply dissolve into that love. This tall, misty being appeared to be overseeing, supervising, or coordinating the operation, though overseeing or supervising don't quite capture the right feeling, dynamic, or relationship accurately. There was absolutely no sense of rigid hierarchy or authoritarian control or command structure or dominance. Everything felt collaborative, cooperative, equal, and joyful, like everyone was participating together equally, harmoniously in something wonderful, meaningful, sacred, and important. When the tall being came close to James, when he approached, something powerful, overwhelming, profound, and transformative happened. James felt his chest cavity expand dramatically, powerfully, as if his heart was suddenly growing far too large for his physical body, as if his heart was expanding infinitely. At the exact same moment, simultaneously, his throat constricted and tightened severely, intensely. A massive, powerful, overwhelming wave of emotion crashed over him like a tsunami, like an ocean wave. He felt like he was about to break down into completely uncontrollable weeping and sobbing, not from sadness or grief or pain of any kind, but from the sheer, overwhelming, almost unbearable intensity of the pure, unconditional, infinite love radiating and emanating powerfully from this being. It was love so complete, so unconditional, so infinite and boundless and limitless that James felt like he might simply dissolve completely into it, merge with it, become one with it. It felt like standing directly in the immediate presence of divine love itself, of God himself, being bathed in it, immersed in it, surrounded completely by it, consumed by it. The atmosphere and environment in this space was surprisingly informal, casual, relaxed and unstructured. The three little hooded beings kept giggling cheerfully amongst themselves, occasionally whispering to each other conspiratorially, and then bursting into more cheerful, delighted, joyful laughter. The tall, misty being just stood there calmly, peacefully radiating that absolutely overwhelming, infinite love, smiling gently, warmly, compassionately, and occasionally chuckling softly at something only he seemed to perceive, understand, or find amusing. After several long moments of this, Christopher decided he needed to take some initiative and move things forward somehow, to progress to the next stage. He looked up at the tall being and said, "Well, I'm obviously clearly not going back there to that other place, to that physical world. So should we proceed with whatever comes next in this process? I've read about life reviews in books and testimonies. Is that what we're going to do now? Should we review my life?" He had encountered numerous, countless accounts of life reviews in near-death experience literature, books, and testimonies. The concept, the idea that you witness your entire life played back in vivid, complete, perfect detail and experience the full consequences and impacts of all your choices and actions from every possible perspective, from every angle. The tall being's response caught James completely off guard and surprised him thoroughly, completely. The being threw his head back gracefully, elegantly, and released a deep, rich, warm, joyful laugh that seemed to resonate and vibrate through James's entire being, through his entire consciousness. It was the kind of laugh that was so genuine, warm, authentic, and full of pure joy that it made you want to laugh along joyfully, happily, even if you didn't understand what was funny, amusing, or entertaining. When the laughter subsided gradually, gently, the being looked down at James with those impossibly loving, compassionate, understanding, accepting eyes, and said warmly, gently, kindly, "Sure, absolutely. Let's do that if you'd like to. Where would you like to start? What would you like to talk about or discuss or explore?" The complete casualness, informality, friendliness, and lack of judgment of it stunned and surprised James thoroughly, completely. This didn't match, align with, or resemble any of the structured, formal, serious, systematic life review processes he had read about in books, articles, and testimonies. Wasn't there supposed to be some kind of organized evaluation, some systematic accounting and judgment of one's actions, choices, decisions? But the being's demeanor was so relaxed, so friendly, welcoming, accepting, and completely non-judgmental that James simply decided to go along with it and see what happened next. He began sharing some memories and stories from his physical life, from his time on Earth, but nothing particularly dramatic, weighty, significant, or important emerged from his consciousness. There were no terrible regrets weighing heavily on his soul, no major sins requiring judgment or redemption, or forgiveness or atonement or punishment. He mentioned one thing that came to his mind. Several years back, probably 6 or 7 years ago, there had been an opportunity, a possibility for him to take a position as a wilderness ranger in the Grand Canyon National Park. His wife had been really excited and enthusiastic about the possibility, the opportunity, the adventure. They would have spent an entire summer season living in a remote ranger station, surrounded by pristine wilderness and natural beauty and solitude, away from the constant stress, trauma, pressure, and intensity of emergency response work. But James had declined the position, turned down the opportunity, choosing instead to remain with the fire department, where he felt he could continue making a real, tangible, meaningful difference in people's lives during their most desperate, frightening, vulnerable moments. Looking back now from this perspective, from this vantage point, he found himself wishing, hoping he had accepted that ranger position. It would have been a beautiful, peaceful, restorative, rejuvenating experience, a cherished season with his beloved wife immersed in nature, beauty, and tranquility. That was honestly, truly, the only significant regret that surfaced in his consciousness, the only thing that came to mind. The tall being listened with patient attention, nodding occasionally gently, his expression radiating gentle understanding, complete acceptance, and unconditional love. When James finished speaking, when he had nothing more to add, the being smiled even more warmly and said kindly, gently, compassionately, "All right, that's sufficient for now. It's time for you to return back to your body now." The words hit James like a physical blow to the chest, like being struck. Return? He stared at the being with complete disbelief, shock, horror, and growing panic. "Return?" he repeated, his voice rising with emotion, fear, desperation. "No, absolutely not. There's no way I'm going back there. Are you serious right now? I'm finally home. I'm finally in the place where I truly belong and have always belonged. Please don't make me go back." But the tall being's demeanor remained absolutely gentle, compassionate, loving, yet completely immovable, firm and final. "No," he said simply, clearly, gently, and definitively. "You have important work that still needs to be completed down there, work that only you can do. You're going back to finish it now." James suddenly realized and noticed that the 3 little hooded beings had completely vanished and disappeared. They had simply ceased to be there, presumably reassigned to other tasks or responsibilities or missions in whatever this facility or realm or dimension was. Now it was just James and the tall, misty being alone together. The being moved even closer, approaching, and James knew with desperate certainty that he had to make one final attempt to stay in this beautiful place, one last plea. He looked up with pleading, desperate, anguished eyes and said urgently, desperately, "Please listen to me carefully, please hear me. The only people who will genuinely miss me are my wife, my 2 children, and my elderly parents. Yes, they'll experience grief and terrible sadness for some period of time, but they're remarkably strong, resilient, capable people. They'll mourn appropriately and properly, and then they'll heal emotionally, and they'll move forward successfully with their lives. They'll ultimately be okay and fine without me. There's really no compelling reason for me to go back there." James genuinely thought this was a reasonable, logical, and convincing argument, but the tall being simply found it touching, endearing, and somewhat amusing. He smiled even more warmly, radiating infinite compassion, and said again with absolute finality, complete certainty, "No, James, you're going back now. It's time." In that precise instant, everything around James began to dissolve, disintegrate, and fragment. It was exactly like watching a television picture break up and fragment when you rapidly switch channels or suddenly lose the broadcast signal completely. The glowing walls, the tables, the mysterious equipment, the soft illumination, everything started to disintegrate and fade away gradually into nothingness, into void. James understood intuitively and immediately what was happening to him, what was occurring. He was being shifted to a different vibrational frequency of existence, a different dimension. He realized in that profound moment that all of reality, absolutely everything that exists across all dimensions and planes and realms, operates on different vibrational frequencies, exactly like different stations on a radio dial. You can have completely different dimensions and realities, occupying exactly the same space, the same location, just vibrating at different rates, different frequencies that normally can't perceive, detect, or interact with each other. He felt himself descending rapidly, sinking downward through multiple layers or levels or dimensions of reality, and it was an unmistakable sensation of lowering, of decreasing in vibration and frequency, of becoming denser, heavier. The tall being faded away gradually, gently like morning mist evaporating under the warmth of rising sunlight, and James fell away into complete, total, absolute darkness, into void. As he descended back toward his physical body, as he dropped down through these various layers or dimensions or frequencies of reality, he passed through a realm that filled him with profound dread, fear, terror, and horror. For many years afterward, he was reluctant and hesitant to mention this particular part of his experience to anyone, but eventually he came to realize it was crucially important for people to know, understand, and be aware. There exists a place, a dimension or realm very close in frequency to our ordinary physical world, that you absolutely, positively do not want to visit or spend any time in whatsoever. It exists at a vibrational frequency just slightly different from our material reality, and it is a place of terrible, crushing, overwhelming loneliness and desolation. It is grey and empty and cold and lifeless and hopeless. There is no love present there, no light, no warmth, no connection between beings, no hope or joy of any kind whatsoever. It's a realm of complete isolation and quiet, desperate, overwhelming despair and suffering. James felt it pulling at his consciousness as he passed through it, like invisible hands trying to grab him, grasp him, and hold him there, trap him there, and he wanted absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with that place, that realm. It served as a stark and sobering reminder that not all non-physical dimensions and realms are beautiful and welcoming and filled with love and light. Some are genuinely dark and frightening and dangerous and horrible, and souls can apparently become trapped or lost or stuck there if they're not extremely careful, vigilant, protected. Then, abruptly and jarringly, suddenly, he was back inside his physical body. The sensation was deeply uncomfortable, unpleasant, almost claustrophobic, like being forcibly stuffed, shoved back into a container or prison that was far too small and confining and restrictive for what he had become, for what he knew himself to be. He remained medically unconscious for several more hours. When he finally began the gradual process of waking up, returning to consciousness, it happened very slowly, gradually, in distinct stages. His first glimmer of awareness was of mechanical beeping and humming sounds, medical monitoring equipment operating constantly, ceaselessly around him. He managed to force his eyes open just slightly, just a tiny crack. Anne saw machines and monitors all around him everywhere, with tubes and wires connected to various parts of his body. He focused his blurry, unfocused attention on one particular monitor that was displaying his blood pressure reading. It showed 42/0. He stared at those numbers for several long moments, many seconds, trying to process what they meant, trying to understand, then slipped back down into unconsciousness, into darkness. Some indeterminate time later, he woke again briefly, partially. The blood pressure reading had improved somewhat, had increased. It now displayed 68/34. He felt a small flicker of hope and relief before darkness claimed him once more, pulled him back down. This pattern repeated itself multiple times over the next several hours. Brief moments of partial awareness where he would check the monitor and see the numbers slowly, gradually climbing upward into the 70s and then the low 80s, followed by periods of unconsciousness and darkness. Finally, during one of his conscious periods, a nurse entered the ICU room and saw his eyes open and focused, alert. "Oh, thank God you're awake!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with genuine surprise, relief, and profound gratitude. James looked at her with confused, disoriented eyes and said weakly, quietly, "I need to talk to you. I need to understand something important." The nurse immediately shook her head firmly. "First, I need to notify the attending physician right away, immediately," she explained quickly, urgently. "You've been unconscious for many, many hours. We honestly weren't at all certain you were going to survive this. We thought we were losing you. The doctor absolutely needs to know immediately that you're alert and responsive and conscious." But James reached out with trembling, shaking fingers and gently touched her arm softly. "Please, just for one moment," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, weak. "I desperately need to understand something crucial. Why am I back here in this body, in this hospital room? I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere beautiful beyond description. I was home with beings I've known since the very beginning of time, since before time existed. How did I end up back here in this place, in this broken body?" The nurse paused, stopped, pulled up a chair, and sat down beside his bed carefully. She had undoubtedly witnessed many extraordinary things during her long nursing career, many years of service. But something about James's earnest confusion and genuine distress touched her heart deeply, profoundly. James continued, his voice trembling with emotion that threatened to overwhelm him completely. "I genuinely thought I had died, I was certain. I was absolutely, completely certain of it, without any doubt. I was in a place that was infinitely more real than this hospital room, more real than anything I've ever experienced during my entire physical life on Earth. And now I'm inexplicably back here in this broken, painful body, and I honestly, truly don't understand why this happened, why I'm back here." The nurse reached out and took his hand in both of hers, squeezing it gently but firmly, holding it. She looked directly into his eyes with deep compassion and understanding, and said softly, gently, "Sweetheart, you came incredibly, unbelievably close to death, closer than most people ever come. But somehow, against all odds and expectations, you pulled through and came back to us here. Now you're here in the land of the living once again, back with us, and as hard as it might be right now, you're just going to have to make peace with that reality and focus on getting yourself healthy and strong again. Focus on healing." James genuinely appreciated her honesty and her compassionate kindness, her gentleness, but her words provided very little actual comfort to his grieving, mourning heart. Throughout the next 12 days of his hospital recovery period, he experienced a persistent, deep, profound sadness that seemed to permeate absolutely everything, every moment. It wasn't the kind of severe clinical depression that requires psychiatric intervention and medication and hospitalization. He could still function adequately, could engage in conversations with visitors, could cooperate fully with the medical staff and physical therapists working with him daily. But underneath all of that normal functioning was a profound sense of loss and mourning that wouldn't go away, wouldn't fade. He grieved deeply for that other realm, that dimension of pure love and limitless joy and absolute freedom and peace. He could feel the vivid memory already beginning to fade and blur which only intensified his sadness and sense of loss profoundly. It was exactly like trying desperately to hold on to a beautiful dream immediately after waking up, feeling all the precious details slip away through your fingers no matter how hard you try to grasp and retain them, to hold them. He knew with certainty that eventually, perhaps soon, he might even begin to seriously question whether it had actually happened at all. Might start convincing himself it was just an elaborate hallucination caused by medication interactions and severe oxygen deprivation to his brain, just a dream. But James absolutely refused to allow the experience to be forgotten, dismissed, minimized, or relegated to the category of medical hallucination or drug-induced dream. So he made a conscious, deliberate decision to start talking about it openly and honestly with everyone. He told absolutely everyone he encountered, everyone he met. He told his fellow firefighters and EMTs back at the station when he finally returned to work months later. He told friends, family members, neighbors, acquaintances, strangers, anyone who would listen for even a moment, anyone who would hear him. He told them all essentially the same core message, the same truth. You need to listen to me very carefully, please hear me. Death is not something we should fear or dread or be terrified of. We have completely and totally misunderstood what it actually is, what it means. It's not an ending or a tragedy or something terrible and final. It's a beautiful transition to something infinitely better than this physical existence, this physical life. It's like graduating to a much higher level of existence and consciousness and being. It happens instantaneously. It's more beautiful than words can possibly describe or capture, and there is absolutely nothing at all to be afraid of, nothing to fear. Over the months and years that followed his near-death experience, people who were struggling terribly with grief and devastating loss would actively seek James out specifically, would come to him. A colleague whose infant daughter had died from sudden infant death syndrome, a neighbor whose husband had been killed in a construction accident, people who were absolutely drowning in overwhelming sorrow and pain and couldn't begin to imagine how they would ever feel remotely whole or complete again, couldn't see how they could go on living. James would sit patiently, lovingly with each grieving person and share compassionately what he had learned through his extraordinary experience. You absolutely must understand something fundamental about the nature of reality and existence and consciousness. Nobody actually truly dies in the way we think they do, in the way we've been taught. That's the crucial truth that changes absolutely everything about how we understand loss and grief and death. When someone we love deeply passes away from this physical world, we haven't actually lost them in any ultimate final sense. They've simply stepped out of their physical body, like removing a coat or costume, and returned to their true home, their real home. They're still completely and entirely themselves, still carrying the exact same personality you loved, still holding all their precious memories, still filled with all their love for you, still aware. They're just existing in a different dimension now, vibrating at a different frequency that our physical eyes and ears can't detect or perceive, and they're so much closer to you than you realize or can imagine or believe. They're literally right here beside you at this very moment right now. You simply can't perceive them with your limited physical senses, but they are absolutely present and aware and loving you. James would patiently, gently explain to these grieving, suffering people that when he left his physical body and traveled through those extraordinary spiritual realms and dimensions, his fundamental core identity remained completely and perfectly intact, unchanged. His essential personality, his characteristic sense of humor, his particular way of thinking and processing information and experiences, that internal narrative voice that constantly runs in your head, making observations and cracking jokes and asking questions and commenting on everything, all of that was still fully present and functioning perfectly. The transition from physical to non-physical existence was absolutely seamless, flawless, and perfect. He didn't transform into a different person or lose any essential aspect of himself or his identity. He simply stepped out of his physical form like removing clothing or a costume and continued being James, just existing in a radically different state of being and consciousness and awareness. And if that was unquestionably true for him, then it must be equally true for absolutely everyone. For every human being, Every single person who has ever died throughout all of human history is still fundamentally themselves, still fully conscious and aware, just no longer confined to or limited by a physical body, just no longer trapped in matter. They haven't actually gone anywhere in any real ultimate sense. They're simply vibrating at a frequency that our physical sensory organs cannot detect or perceive or measure. This powerful message brought profound comfort and genuine hope to many people who were suffering through terrible grief and loss. Several people told James with tears streaming down their faces that his testimony had literally saved their lives, that they had been seriously, actively contemplating suicide to escape their unbearable emotional pain and suffering, but his words had given them hope and helped them find the strength and courage to carry on living, to keep going. James felt deeply in his soul that this was a significant part of his purpose, perhaps the main reason why he had been sent back to physical life, to share this liberating truth, to help suffering people understand that death is not the ultimate tragedy and permanent ending we've all been culturally conditioned to believe it is, that it's been taught to us. But then came the inevitable pushback and social pressure, the resistance. After approximately 9 months of openly and enthusiastically sharing his near-death experience story with anyone who would listen, a longtime co-worker and close personal friend approached James one afternoon at the fire station during a quiet moment. The man looked uncomfortable, awkward, hesitant, and nervous, but his message was unmistakable and clear and firm. "Hey, James, listen carefully to me," he said quietly, softly, glancing around nervously to make absolutely sure no one else was within earshot, that they were alone. "I'm telling you this as a friend who genuinely cares about you and your well-being and your future. Some people around here, including some administrators and supervisors and chiefs, are starting to talk and express serious concerns about you. They're saying you've been acting strange or odd or different, that maybe the experience and the medications affected you more profoundly than you realize or want to admit or acknowledge. Some folks are privately suggesting you might really benefit from talking to a professional counselor or therapist or psychiatrist about all this intense spiritual stuff you keep talking about. I'm just saying, as your friend, you might want to be considerably more selective and careful and cautious about who you share this experience with going forward. Maybe keep it to yourself more." The words cut James deeply and painfully, wounded him. Here he was, earnestly sharing what he genuinely, absolutely believed was the most important, hopeful, liberating truth that any human being could possibly hear. Actual proof that death is not the final end, that we don't permanently lose the people we love, that there's an indescribably beautiful existence waiting for every single one of us. And he was being told to shut up about it, to keep quiet, to stop talking about it, because it made people uncomfortable, or seemed crazy, or indicated mental instability, or made him seem unreliable. James thought about similar situations throughout human history, throughout time. He knew that people who had profound spiritual experiences or mystical encounters often faced severe ridicule, persecution, rejection, or worse when they tried to share what they had learned with others, with society. He was facing a difficult choice with real consequences and implications: continue courageously speaking his truth and risk serious damage to his professional reputation and career and livelihood, or stay silent and keep the transformative experience locked away inside himself where it couldn't help anyone, couldn't serve its purpose. Reluctantly, painfully, with deep sadness and resignation, James made the difficult decision to stop talking about his experience publicly, openly. He closed his mouth, locked the memories away deep inside himself, and tried to act completely normal, tried to fit in. For the next 16 long, difficult years, he barely mentioned his near-death experience to anyone outside his immediate family circle. He went back to his regular work routine, continued his dedicated career in emergency services, competed in his athletic events and competitions, and lived what appeared from the outside to be a completely normal, ordinary, unremarkable life. But the vivid memory of that extraordinary night in 1994 never truly left him or faded away completely. It was always there, just beneath the surface of his everyday consciousness, quietly waiting patiently for its moment to re-emerge, to resurface. Then in 2010, James retired from active firefighting and emergency medical service after nearly 3 decades of dedicated service. He was in his late 50s by that point, ready and eager to begin an entirely new chapter of his life journey, a new phase. But almost immediately after he stopped working, as soon as he had abundant time to sit quietly in stillness and reflect deeply without the constant demands and distractions of emergency calls and training exercises and shift work and responsibilities, the memory of his near-death experience came flooding back into his consciousness with overwhelming, undeniable, irresistible force. It was as if the experience had been dormant, held carefully at bay by the relentless busyness and structure and demands of his working life, and now it was demanding his complete and total attention, demanding to be understood. James became absolutely consumed, obsessed with finding deeper answers and achieving greater understanding of what had actually happened to him during those extraordinary hours that night. He began an intensive, obsessive personal research project, reading absolutely everything he could possibly find about near-death experiences, consciousness studies, quantum physics, spirituality, mysticism, theology, and ancient wisdom traditions from cultures all around the world, from every tradition. He discovered that many traditional societies throughout human history, the mystics, the shamans, the indigenous wisdom keepers, the contemplative monks, the saints, had preserved and transmitted profound knowledge about the fundamental nature of reality and consciousness that modern Western civilization had largely forgotten, systematically dismissed, ridiculed, or even actively suppressed and hidden deliberately. But that fascinating journey of discovery and deeper understanding is truly a story for another time, for another day. What matters most profoundly for today, what James wanted every person to know and understand with absolute certainty and conviction, is this core truth, this essential message. Death is absolutely not what we have been taught and conditioned to believe it is throughout our lives. It is not an ending, not a tragedy, not something to dread or fear with anxiety and terror and dread. It is a transition, a transformation, a homecoming, a return to our authentic nature as eternal beings of pure consciousness and unconditional love and infinite awareness. The precious people we have loved and lost are not truly gone or annihilated or erased from existence forever. Our beloved pets and animal companions who have died have not ceased to exist or been destroyed. They are all still here, still present, still existing, living and thriving in frequencies and dimensions, just slightly different from our ordinary physical reality, still completely themselves, still fully aware and conscious and loving, still absolutely filled with love for us, still watching over us, and one day, when our own appointed time finally comes to leave these temporary physical bodies behind and return home to our true home, we will joyfully, gratefully join them in that magnificent realm of infinite light and boundless love and eternal joy and perfect peace. That is James Rivera's heartfelt testimony, his message, and his deepest, most fervent hope and prayer is that by sharing his extraordinary story, he can bring genuine comfort, lasting peace, and real hope to anyone who desperately needs to hear it, to anyone who is suffering or grieving or afraid.